Good afternoon, everybody. It says to wait a few seconds for everyone to join. So here we are. Welcome, everybody. I'm Peter Guenther, and I will be talking today about sending xAPI from JavaScript. When I first pitched this idea to Megan, I said, it'll be a hands-on session. It'll be a code along. And as I got into the weeds in the last few days, what exactly does that look like? We'll be going through code. You will have an opportunity to get your own copy of it. I think it'll be more copy and pasting than coding, simply because in a short bit of time like this, trying to get all the colons and commas right is a little tiresome. So I've got something ready to go for you with the code in it, and you'll just have to move some things around and enable them, but we'll talk through how everything works. But first, I want to give a little introduction. My plan is to spend hopefully no more than 15 minutes on this intro, and then get into the coding. So I'll watch that time. I think in the interest of time, you're welcome to pop questions in the chat, and towards the end of the intro section, I will go into them. And then when we get coding, then certainly I'll be paying attention to your questions and trying to catch them right as we go. So for those of you who saw my session in February, the second or third week of the xAPI cohort, this is going to be very familiar. Parts are extended, parts are different, but it is very much based on that session. So some of this may be a little familiar to you, but I am a data engineer at Watershed. Talk more about Watershed in a minute. As you may have seen this morning in the passing of the torch, I am a former host of the xAPI cohort in late 2018, early 2019. My background is teaching coding, particularly in middle and high school, instructional design in higher ed, and teaching coding boot camps. I'm currently back in the learner role as well. I'm a master's student in game design at Michigan State and loving that about halfway through. End of the summer, I should be at the halfway point. And I am a self-taught tinkerer. So I learned xAPI through the xAPI cohort. I largely learned to code by playing with code myself. And I still love to get hands-on with different things, games and beyond. So we'll talk about that as we go too. So Watershed. Watershed is a learning record store, but it is more. So as a learning record store, it stores xAPI statements. We'll be using it as our learning record store today. And we'll take a look at, what gets into the LRS. And we'll also do a little bit of analytics, nothing too fancy. But Watershed is a learning analytics platform on top of that. So if I were to identify the two biggest pieces of what makes Watershed different, and not to turn this into a big sales piece, but you're going to be seeing these when we go into, you're going to see one of the two when we go into Watershed. One is that we store HR data as well. And so we can tie that business data together with the learning data. And the second is we have robust and really interesting and powerful reporting tools. So you can take your xAPI data and you can tell stories with it. So this is not one of the geek-free sessions. Megan said this morning, xAPI has largely become geek-free, and that's totally true. This is not that session. So this is for people who want to get their hands in the code a little bit. And maybe you just want to learn. Maybe you're not ready to do the code yourself, but you're here to see it. Maybe you want to get hands-on, and if it's not working, you want to get help, and you're willing to share your screen and we'll work through the problem. Both of those things are fine, but don't get scared off if you're looking at the code and saying, I thought xAPI was supposed to be geek-free and friendly. There are lots of other tools for that. I will talk a little bit about some of the use cases. Why would you want to go in and code this yourself instead of using a tool that's already xAPI enabled? So one of the things I promised in the description is I want to go through the xAPI statement and show some of the xAPI code. So often we talk about, Peter completed this module and say that's an xAPI statement, which it is. But for xAPI to work, there has to be something more technical behind it. There are JavaScript objects in JavaScript object notation called JSON for short. And we're going to be looking at that JSON code before we use JavaScript to send xAPI. So there are 5+ pieces to an xAPI statement. 3 are required. The first one that is required is the actor. Who is doing this thing? Who is having the experience? There are 2 main ways to identify the actor. There are a couple others, but 2 main ones. The most common you'll see is the top one here on the right, that the actor is identified with an email address, or an mbox for short. And that's what we'll be sending today. And so within the xAPI statement, you have a block of code that says this is the email, this is the person's name. You can skip the name. You could just have the email. And then you have to identify this is an agent. There are group actors as well. You could say the team did this. We'll just be working with agents today. The other way to identify an actor, and I left the spelled out name here. I could have this name Peter Guenther down here as well, is with an account. And so the account exists of some kind of ID. It might again be an email, but it's the email that somebody uses to log into a specific system. This is just a made up one, but often it can be an ID as well. And so in this case, and I am going to fix this slide on the fly, in this case, the first name here, this is like the username. This is how the person is identifying themselves on the system. And this is the technical, this is the actor. The second name is the spelled out human readable. And so when we say Peter Guenther completed this module, it's using this second name. So every xAPI statement is going to have a block with an actor. Most of them are going to look like one of these 2. Next, we have the verb. Verb is also one of the required elements. The only thing that is required is the ID. And so here you can see the ID looks like a URL, like a web address. It's in fact an IRI, an internationalized, it can have non-English characters, resource identifier. But those tend to look like web addresses as a nice hierarchical way to say who's in charge. Okay, ADL.net has defined this. It's in their Experience API or xAPI domain. It's among the verbs and it's called answered, whereas this one is completed. So you can see the IRI gives us a nice hierarchical structure. We're going to see that in other IDs as well. But these are 2 examples of verbs. The display is just for making a human readable statement. And most learning record stores are going to identify the main verbs. If I left out answered, my learning record store might well know to translate that to answered in English. And you can do other languages as well. When you need to find a verb that suits your needs, there are a couple places you can go. One is the xAPI registry, which is actually run by our sister company, Rusticy, who just spoke last session. The other is the ADL's xAPI vocab server. That has recently been folded into the profile server, and the xAPI vocab itself has disappeared. So I didn't provide a link. It has changed. The status is unclear, but I certainly hope that is coming back. There are other, and if not, then I imagine various other resources are going to step in. There are other places you can look for verbs. Ideally, you're using a standard verb. Many of them are defined from profiles, and so you can still get those off the ADL profile server. But if necessary, create your own. And I'll talk about an example where I would create my own in a little bit. But at the very least, for a verb, you are going to need one of these web address shaped IDs. So that's the second required element. The third required element, the last one, is the object. What is the activity taking place? What is being experienced? What is the action, the verb being done to? I apologize that some of these are long lines and they're getting split up, but Here's the xAPI party. Again, this IRI gives us a nice hierarchical structure. So it's Torrance Learning, for now. I could change that in the future to xAPI cohort or Learning Guild, but torrancelearning.com, and they've got a bucket for activities. And within activities, they might have modules, courses. They've also got events. And there's this xAPI party, but they've done 16 of them. And so there's the 2021 December, but we're in the 2022 May. And so we have a nice technical ID to uniquely identify this particular event, this particular activity. Okay, so that is required for the object. You've got to have an ID. Often you want to have a little bit more. So the name is really important. I always encourage people to include names. And again, it could be multiple languages. I just have English, US English, and it's the May 2022 xAPI party. And so from these three statements, you could have Peter Guenther completed the May 2020 xAPI party. That's the human readable. And then you've got all this JSON code behind it to spell it out. Description can be valuable. I haven't seen a ton of use cases where it really gets used. But if you have one, and I just copied this off the xAPI cohort page, it's good to include. The other thing that we always encourage people to include is the type. And so down here at the bottom of the definition, there is a standard activity type for a conference. So even though it says it's a party, we're going to call it a conference. Where do I find that? Same resources I pointed to on the last page, either the xAPI registry or the ADL's vocab server if it comes up and running. And then you're almost always going to include object type activity. That's just, there are a few other possibilities. You could potentially, if the verb is emailed, the object could be another person. You emailed another actor or agent. It could be a group. You enrolled this group. Normally it's going to be an activity. And so what exactly you're identifying as the object is going to depend on the verb and the action. We'll talk about mainly one specific example in a web page. Result is optional, but it's going to tell you, did they succeed? Did they complete it? They're not the same. I could complete the course and fail it. That would be completion true, success false. You're not usually going to see the opposite, but you could have success false, completion false as well. If this is a question, there might be a response. I might have answered the xAPI no. You might want to record how long it took. It took me 1 minute and 8 seconds to answer this. And then there's scaled. Maybe this was a multiple choice question where there are 3 right answers and I only got 1. The reality is I forgot to update that number when I changed. Scaled is from 0 to 1. And so 1's 100%. I did update this. You could have scored from 0 to 3. xAPI gnome obviously is the right answer, so it's worth full points. The raw score has to be between my minimum and my maximum. So I scored 3 out of 3 or 100%, meaning I succeeded and I completed this item. There's also context. Context, I'm just going to hit briefly. It is really important, and it's where xAPI really gives richness and power. Context activities are other objects, other activities around this particular activity. So when our button sends an xAPI statement, it's not just the button sending it, it's the button in the context of this web page that it's embedded on. So the parent is the web page that we're going to go to, and we're going to build this. I mean, this is the address of mine. When you make a copy, it'll be a different address, but this is the parent. This xAPI example page. And again, I'm identifying type. Okay, but there's a larger context. The larger context is the xAPI party. So this should look pretty familiar because it is the same way I defined the xAPI party a couple slides ago as the object of a different statement. But here, the object is I clicked this button. I interacted with this button on this page, the parent, and then in this larger grouping, of the May 2022 xAPI party. There are a couple other types of context activities. You've got category, which could include, if you're using an xAPI profile, you identify it thusly. It could be a source. If I made a mobile app and this is happening within this screen, but the higher up, I want to identify the app, the source. There's that. And there's also other. So if you have any other context that you want to identify, it's there. Real quickly, there are other things that you will see in an xAPI statement. Timestamp and stored are always going to be there. The timestamp is when the system sent it. If it's not there, the learning record store is going to fill it in. The stored is when the learning record store received it. So typically it's going to be a little bit after, 11 milliseconds after I sent it, Watershed got the statement. And then authority, in this case, Watershed is identifying this particular xAPI data source I created, sent the statement, and then I didn't do anything special, so it just sent it as version 1.0.0. I also want to mention there are extensions. These are properties you can add to the activity, to the result, the context, to store additional information. When Megan says it's future-proofed, that's one of the things she's talking about. You can add these extensions for very specific use cases. If you're watching a video, there might be some very specific information you want to store. What volume? Did they maximize it? How much of it did they watch? Did they pause it at a point? Did they skip a point? All that stuff can get stored with extensions. We're not going to get to it today. So I see some questions. Let me pop over. Will the slides be available after the session? Yes, Andrew, slides will be available. I'm going to leave one out, although I suppose I really don't have to, since the video will be available after as well. But that just has some credentials that I don't want text searchable, even though I'm going to kill them in a week. There for you to be able to work with this. Any other questions? Could CMI.interaction be context category instead of object? Stephen, I'd have to look at that. I don't do a ton of CMI5 myself, so I don't want to give you the wrong answer, but the profile spells that out. Whatever the CMI5 profile documents is what you want to do. I think you're definitely going to identify in a category that it's following the CMI5 profile. But the CMI interaction, I think you probably are going to want as the type, because that has specific result and possibly object extensions tied to it. So you're probably going to want both, but whatever the profile says. All right, so real briefly as I wrap up the intro before we get hands-on, just a couple of use cases. Why would I code this myself or have somebody on my team or a contractor or a third party code this rather than just using a tool that sends xAPI? So one example is maybe I want an attendance roster. This is something that I built while I was at Torrance Learning back in 2018. There is an used to be eLearning Guild article about it, 4 creative ways to send xAPI data from non-eLearning sources. But this is written in JavaScript, and it allows you to either load a CSV or manually enter names, hit a button, and attendance statements are sent to the learning record store. So that's something that got coded. There wasn't an off-the-shelf tool for that. Likewise, I might want to make a specific performance checklist for a coach within my organization. There are some tools that do this really well. xAPI apps is really good with performance checklists and stuff. But I might want to simply code my own. And so this would be a web page. It would be available perhaps on my intranet, perhaps behind a password. But coach could identify the learner, and then what behaviors were seen and not seen, give ratings, add comments, hit a button, statements are sent. Again, custom JavaScript coding. Thank you for that link, Karen. That's the page I just mentioned. Internet of Things devices. And so at Torrance Learning, there's a conference room that has a switch on the door, magnetic switch, and an xAPI statement is sent whenever somebody enters the room or leaves, and it sends some additional context information. There's one of those extensions. It's sending a temperature at the time. A couple of years ago, I think it must have been May of 2019, we did a hands-on session, one of these maker spaces during the xAPI cohort when we were in person, xAPI party, and the car sent statements. There's an article about this, and I stripped the link out of this slideshow, but it looks like Matt's right on top of things. Thank you. And then finally, this is an example that did, oh, it's a further example, same slide. I've been talking about this for years. Megan's been hearing me say it since 2018, and other projects keep coming to the fore, but a boxing trainer. If I were to do this, I might write it in JavaScript. I was planning to do this with Node, which is a JavaScript framework. And then I'd need some new verbs. There isn't a verb for punched the last I checked. So I would make my own profile and I would define a verb. And again, I would just be careful to come up with a really good definition of the verb. And that would be the statement that I sent. All right. And then this is something I was working on over Christmas. It is an exercise bike. And this I coded in Python. It was, the electronics went bad on the exercise bike, so I hooked up a Raspberry Pi to measure instead, and I built a little game around it. And so you use the contacts as buttons to play the game. It measures your speed. And again, going to send custom xAPI statements either in JavaScript or from Python. All right, I want to move on to sending xAPI statements. So if you're going to send xAPI statements, you're going to need a learning record store. And I did not update this slide from my February talk. I meant to. So this is showing the old sandbox and not the one that we're using today. But I have the information you need elsewhere. So you'll be sending statements to Watershed today, specifically to a sandbox that I created. I'm going to leave up, and you can you'll be able to use it for about a week, and then after that you'll need your own. You can certainly send statements in C#, Stephen. When you send a statement, the content of the statement is going to be JSON. But it doesn't matter the language sending it. There are libraries for C#, for Python, for Flutter is a Google language, Java. There's a ton of libraries out there. You can send it from whatever you want. And if the library doesn't exist and you're comfortable coding to APIs, you could send it, manually the hard way from whatever language. In the code, you are going to see an endpoint or a URL. And that is where exactly is this learning record store that is storing your statements. And then key and secret are like a username and password. When you saw source in my code example before, that was identifying, our source is going to be xAPI party. And then the key will also be identified there. And the secret is the password. So I'm giving these out to you today. There's a limited amount of damage you can do with it because I have this learning records. Obviously, Watershed has a separate learning record store for each, customer, each client, each organization. But additionally, within my sandbox, it's isolated. It doesn't give you broader access. So normally you would not share these things out, but to make this work today, I have to. So you'll have to use a library, and I'm not going to delve into that because I kind of just did. We're going to use the one from our sister company, Rusticy, Watershed sister company. I have not played with xAPI.js. Matt Cleaver tells me it's good, and he's been using it, I think, more recently. There's also the ADL xAPI wrapper. I do want to mention this xAPI lab, which is really helpful for mocking up statements. The URL is in the slide deck, which will be available. But when I copied code JSON into those previous slides about what's a verb, what's an actor, I mocked it up here because that I knew that would give me, the correct. So sometimes when I'm troubleshooting, I will jump into that tool. If you're comfortable with APIs, Postman or Insomnia are also helpful. There's a governance and a planning, a design phase that I'm skipping over today because today's about nuts and bolts. Let's send xAPI. But you are going to have to decide with the instructional designers and potentially the client, what interactions do you want to send statements for? What are the right verbs? What are the activity types that make sense? How are we going to structure our activity IDs? I do have a resource I'm going to share at the end with a lot of good information and things to think about there. But we're going to jump into the coded portion. So let me paste this into the discussion. You can go ahead and click that. And I did not call it, my slides weren't showing at the beginning, so we might lose a couple of minutes here to creating an account. But you can just click that link. If you don't have a CodePen account yet, please go ahead and create one because you won't be able to do that. You won't be able to copy this and start modifying it. David, security is beyond the scope of today. There are libraries for PHP and things like that. You could do it server-side in C#, in Java, in PHP. There's a variety of tools, but you're going to, at some point you have to expose something, but you don't necessarily have to expose the these things. Now, what I've done, and I'm going to spend a minute or two on this while people are getting over to CodePen. What I've done is I have set this access to isolated, meaning if you have this key that I've given you, you can't read any statements that were sent from any other source except this one. So that's one way of protecting it. Another way, some LRSs will have read-only keys and write-only keys. And so you can't go reading somebody else's information, even if you delve into the code and you dig those things up. But there are a variety of options for even more secure xAPI sending, and that's a great topic for another session. Exactly how you're going to... Those features vary from LRS to LRS provider. They aren't part of the conformance definition. So we can choose to provide, this isolated. Another LRS might not provide isolated, but they might provide read-write. That can differ. All right. So when you go to the link that I provided, it's purple for me. It may not be for you, but just above David's. When you go to that link, you're going to see something not quite like this. You are going to see a bigger CSS tab. We're not touching the CSS today. So you can just minimize CSS. Don't minimize JavaScript, but the middle one, you can minimize CSS. So you're seeing these things bigger. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more, hopefully to make this readable for everybody. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the HTML page and spend more time on the JavaScript. So this is old school basic HTML. First off, I'm not dressing it up at all. Secondly, I'm doing a couple things here that front-end developers would frown on, would tell me that's outdated, that's wrong, don't do it that way now. I'm just trying to keep it simple. So this is a web form. It's going to have, some fields. It can have some buttons. So I've got a field for name. I've got a field for email. And then I've got two buttons. One of these is going to call a JavaScript function that I've already written called send xAPI, and it's going to send it with the argument button1. So when it sends the statement, it's going to say the object was button1. And then the second one is going to call that same function, but it's going to say the object was button2. The TinCan.js library is included in my settings, so you're not going to see it here, but it is. I have a copy of it up on my website, and so it's just hitting that library. I did try, for those of you more technical, I did try to put the npm library for it in, and it was not working. I had to time box that and just give up on that, but I am using the TinCan library. And so over here in the JavaScript, I'm calling things that are not directly referenced here. Okay, I had a question I just wanted to ask the group, and I'm not sure. If you're planning to code along, would you use the reaction buttons? Give me a thumbs up if you are in, or if you're planning to code along and you aren't in yet, send me a different reaction. I don't have the reactions in front of me, so I don't know what the what a negative one would be, but maybe a crying emoji or what. I don't know what that emoji was, but it looks like we've got people who are not in yet. Jamie's suggesting sunglasses, oh, that's okay. I was reading the positive space negative. So okay, okay, so we've got some people who are still getting in. So I'm going to take a moment, rather than doing anything that's going to frustrate people who are not in yet. Are there any other questions I can answer right now? Because even if you're still getting your account made, you can always go back and watch this in the video. Stephen, advantages of using one library over another, it's personal preference. It's been a while since I've worked with the ADL library. I know at Torrance Learning, I used one of the libraries for one and one for other projects. And there were some specific things I didn't like about one or the other. My choosing it for February and for today is, one, I'm a little more up to speed on it, and two, I think the documentation is better, and three, it's from Watershed sister company, so I'm going their way. Matt has said great things about xAPI.js, or positive things at least. I just haven't taken the time to look at it. And Rusticy, that's a great point, David. Rusticy does have the TinCan library in several languages. And so if you do get used to it and you need to switch to a different language, that could be a good reason for using it. Great point. There are other libraries by other providers. I'm not super familiar with them. A lot of things do use the Rusticy derived libraries. For instance, I think GBL xAPI, the game-based learning library, I believe it just wraps the Rusticy. Could be wrong. It could be wrapping the other. Okay, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I am going to press ahead. If you're hoping to code along and you're not ready yet, then again, you can always go back and watch the video and code along. Last question for now, Andrew, are there issues with capturing statements in non-Western languages like Korean? That's a great question, great example. There should not be. It is part of the xAPI spec. It can get a little tricky. And at Watershed, we had an example specifically with Korean recently where I forget the exact issue. But because these are IRIs, it's part of the conformance test, to my knowledge. You should be fine. You might not be able to display those on your platform when you pull them back out. If you don't have the font enabled, or you don't have it set up to handle those, or you've got some other code which is not handling them as IRIs, then that can burn you. But a conformant LRS should be fine storing non-Western languages. Great question. Okay, so looking at the JavaScript for now, I'm gonna move this over. For the tin can library, I have to say, hey, I'm gonna have a variable that's gonna hold a reference to the learning record store. So I'm gonna call it LRS. In JavaScript, a try-catch structure tries code that might fail, especially code that has to talk across the internet, etc. And if it fails, you want to handle it in different ways. That's the catch. That's why we're doing a try. So I am calling this tin can library, which I've added in the settings in CodePen, and you would do it in a script tag at the end of your code if you were doing it in a regular web page. I can point you to another version of this that has that. Or if you were to just download your code from CodePen, it would work it in. And I'm working in these credentials that I showed you a couple minutes ago in Watershed. And so I'm saying this is the endpoint for my LRS. This is who I am and how I'm getting there. Again, some LRSs will say key and secret. Some libraries will say username, password. The secret is the password. Okay, so it's going to create this connection. And if it fails, it's going to give us a warning. I'm going to skip down in my code. I've got an isValid string, which is just a stupidly simple test of whether my email address is valid or not. I would want a much more robust test, but right now it's just checking, is it at least 3 characters, just to keep it simple. Okay, so you'll see that referenced. And then further down, this is everything we're going to be copying in to make this work. Okay, but let's get back to the meat. And I will have you now, if you haven't already, if you're logged in, go ahead and click the Fork This Page button, and it's going to pop you up in another window, and you will be able to edit it now. And now I will not be overwriting my starter if I make changes. Okay, but the send xAPI function, this block of code, is what these buttons call. They call send xAPI. And they're passing simply a string, button 1 or button 2, but they're passing an activity name, or activity string. Okay. So what's this code doing? It is going into the document on the page, and it's getting the full name, which means it's going to get whatever was typed into this box. It's going to check, is it at least 3 characters? It's going to do the same thing with email. It's going to get whatever value is typed in this box. It's going to put it into a variable called email, and it's going to check, is it at least 3 characters? Again, your statement will be rejected by the Learning Record Store if it doesn't have, if it doesn't look like an email, if it doesn't have at least a character, an at, a character, a dot, and a couple characters. There's at least, I believe, that level of checking. So in a real example, I would have a validate email function that would be checking for those things. Okay. And then I'm just writing a little message to myself. Hey, I'm creating this statement for troubleshooting, debugging. And now I'm going to use the tin can library to construct a new statement. We said statement needs 3 things. It needs the actor, the verb, and the object. We're going to move actor and verb here in a minute. You might say, Peter, why does it say target, not object? And the answer is, in JavaScript, the word object has a different meaning. And so I can't call it the object. And so they are calling it the target of the activity in this language. That's going to be true in a lot of languages. Object is a reserved word that you can't just use to say, oh, this is the object. Okay. And I see the question, I will get to it, but I would like those of you who are following along, I'd like you to scroll down. For me and probably for you, it's lines 95 through 101. So from the word actor through, including the comma after the verb. You're going to grab that block. You're going to copy it. Control C on my keyboard. And you're going to, you can either post it below the comments or you can get rid of the comments. Just don't get rid of anything else. Don't worry about if it's not tabbed right. It bothers me more than I'd like to admit, but you don't really have to worry about that. So what it's doing is it's constructing this actor portion of the object with the name and the email that it got from the form. And then to keep it simple, I am just using the verb ID. Interactive, believe it or not, there is not a clicked verb in the regular profiles for xAPI. Interacted is probably the best choice here. So you're going to paste that in, and you're going to we'll just look at target. So I've built this ID for the xAPI party, and then I called xAPI example is the page. I could have built another level in there, sending statements from JavaScript. And then it's just appending the activity, meaning it's appending either button 1 or button 2, depending on how it was called. I hope you go modifying, playing with this page after today. And if you do, you're going to need to make sure that you don't put spaces into these activity names, because you can't have an unencoded space in an ID. I don't know offhand if Tin Can will clean that up and encode it for you. Okay. So it's just, I've got the type. This is an interaction, not a CMI5 interaction. It's going to be the xAPI party example, sending xAPI from JavaScript, button 1 or button 2. Okay. So I've got the 3 required elements for an xAPI statement. I've got the actor, I've got the verb, I've got the object here in the target section. So go ahead and save. If you've copied the actor and verb up, go ahead and save it. I'm going to change the name of mine so I can keep these straight and try it out. So down here at the bottom of the page, it is live. And I'm going to put Megan Torrance, because I have a bunch of variations of Peter Guenther already in the Learning Record store. And make up an email. I'm going to hit button 1. This is just CodePen showing me what would normally be a behind the scenes statement. I'd normally be logging this in the inspector or the console, but that indicates that the Learning Record store got my statement. Going to hit button 2. Again, it looks like it got through. I'm going to jump over. And so in Watershed, I am going to give you a username and password for Watershed. When you log in, you will see on the dashboard, you will see Matt Cleaver's got his sent already, but you will see some basic dashboards. But if you go to data search, you will see Martin has successfully sent a statement. And if you click the statement, you will see the full JSON, everything that you put in there, everything that Watershed added. Okay. So Martin's worked and he clicked his button 1. Okay. Which I could have seen up top in the summary as well. So this is the human readable pulling out of those basic elements. This is the code, which gives us all kinds of information to work with. Okay. I think as we run out of time, I'm going to hit a couple of questions, but go ahead on your own time. There's a spot for result and a spot for context, and the cheat sheet has them there. Go ahead, copy those in, try them out. If it's not working, you can ping me on the xAPI cohort Slack. and we'll try to figure out what's going on. But let me hit a few questions. Is it best practice to validate on your front end code rather than letting the LRS to reject it? Yes, for a couple of reasons. One, if you've got a huge rollout, to avoid adding load to your learning record store, you want to check it on the front end. The second reason is it's a lot easier to catch it and get them to fix the form before you send the statement than it is afterwards. So, why do the extra work? Why try sending the statement? Good systems check both on the front end and the back end. There is a save button so the CodePen will let you save any changes here with this save button. There will be a yellow underline if you have unsaved changes. No, activity, Martin. Activity does not have a space in it here. These things, it's button 2. It's button 1. Best practice, make it more readable. I would put a dash in there instead of a space. Okay, so it looks like it's stripped the space from button 1 to put button 1. I don't think it's stripped the space. I think if I were to put a space in, either it's going to encode it. That's going to reject. It's either going to encode it or it's going to fail. Statement failed. So the library is not fixing that for me. If I have a dash, and the form's going to blank out because that's CodePen reloading when I make a change. But if I have a dash, it's going to go through. Okay, we are out of time. I am happy to stay and answer questions, or they are probably going to like us to go to a table, a breakout table between times. So, Jamie, if you just want to direct us, we'll go anywhere if people want to keep chatting. Always too much to cram into 45 minutes, but I hope this was a useful introduction. And again, if you do the last couple copy pastes and you're trying to get it to work, then just ping me on the xAPI cohort Slack. Thank you all.